Hi, welcome to session 2 of the ninth topic of the semester. This is the last topic on the Civil War and Reconstruction from 1860 to 1877. All right, so this is session 2, and we're going to proceed by looking at the factors, the causes that led to the Civil War. So this is something that we have been doing, again, in session 1, looking at the background. Again, this is very important, looking at the historical factors that led to the Civil War. And we started looking at, one of the first factors we looked at, again, rather quickly here, is the issue of sectionalism. That the country really had been divided, by two sections ever since the beginning of the United States, back in the colonial period when the British came to North America and developed the 13 colonies. That the upper colonies and the lower colonies were settled by different peoples, particularly in terms of the North settled by religious groups like the Puritans, for example, the Quakers, who came with certain ideas, like, for example, the ideas of economic success and the ideas of salvation in terms of prosperity, what we call the gospel of prosperity, for example. And of course, the Quakers also introduced the ideas of abolitionism, that again, they rejected the idea of slavery and the slave trade because of their religions. And in the North, we're going to see, of course, the northern colonies establishing different kinds of societies and economic systems more geared towards the market. It's a commercial-driven society of producers. It's a society of producers, peoples of very different occupations and trades, again, that are going to establish really a commercial economy based on consumer products, a market economy, and trade, again, the export of products as well. And in the South, again, a society of planters pretty much coming to, grow things like tobacco and rice. It really develop plantations and introduce the system of slavery as well, the labor system, again, in the South, in the lower colonies. So we got very different societies, again, that developed very early on in the 1600s very differently. Two sections really, drastically opposed to one another. That will continue to develop in a very different direction as the colonies proceeded and gained independence and they formed the United States. We can see that, again, the Industrial Revolution pretty much separated those two sections even further, because we're going to see the rise of industrial capitalism in the North, the rise of factories, railroads, the rise of wage labor, again, very important, a wage labor economy, people working for wages, and the rise of a middle class, again, very different, very modern oriented. The North is like going through a makeover, if you will, whereas the southern states are going to continue with agriculture production, an agricultural economy based on plantations and slave labor as well. And there was, of course, a group of small farmers that actually continue, of course, along with the planter class. Again, there's going to be, of course, a large group of small farmers that existed, of course, in the South, that are going to really create an alliance with the planter class, not to do away with slavery. Again, we examined those factors in session 1, and we started looking at also territorial expansion. This is another dividing issue that will divide Americans between the two sections, how to grow westward. Americans are moving now westward because of different territorial purchases, like the Louisiana Purchase, for example, of 1803. Americans are moving westward, settling the Louisiana territory, but the issue of slavery divided public opinion. In the North, people want free land, free soil, for farming, for people to actually own land, develop their own farms. And in the South, planters wanted, to move slavery. in the Western territories, in the Louisiana territory, in order to grow more cotton. Again, the cotton plantations, and move slave labor as well, in the West. And we saw that again, really leading up to a crisis. In session one, we were looking at a territorial crisis in 1819 called the Missouri Crisis, when, again, we're going to see territory after territory in the Louisiana Purchase, again, settled by slave owners, people that were bringing in the slaves again, to places like Louisiana, and the Louisiana becomes a state in 1811, 1812. It's a slave state. They're settling also the territory of Arkansas, the territory of Missouri, and Missouri applied to the Union as a slave state, and that really ignited a national debate. In the United States, Americans are now really arguing about, slavery in the Louisiana territory, and the nation was already in a state of crisis. So the Missouri Compromise, really, this compromise saved the Union at that point, because it kind of divided the Louisiana territory into two segments. The slave owners were going to keep the South. Louisiana, Arkansas, and Missouri were going to be slave states, and the upper chunk of the Louisiana territory was to be free. It was called the Nebraska Territory. All the upper section, again, the Nebraska Territory, was to be free soil. So that kind of settled, disputes and differences between the two sections. And for a while, there were relative, stability, relative peace in the United States. But this peace does not last very long, because in 1848, there will be yet an additional territory added to the United States that was ceded by Mexico. Okay, so this territory was ceded by Mexico after a war. Actually, again, Mexico and the United States went to war from 1845 to 1847. This is called the Mexican-American War. And after the war, that did not last very long, by the way, Mexico surrendered and signed a treaty with the United States called the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, in which Mexico sold a large portion of its territory, the northern part, again, to the United States for $15 million, just like the Louisiana Purchase. France sold it to the United States for $15 million. Likewise, Mexico actually sold this land for $15 million as well. It's called the Mexican Cession. You can see that in this map. Again, this is really a piece of land that encompasses California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, parts of New Mexico, and Colorado, all of which were now added to the United States, new territories. And of course, there's great hopes that, well, we got additional land to move into. In this case, California represented the best, the best territory of all this session, because Arizona and New Mexico and Colorado were, kind of in a desert type, very rocky soil, etc. Not very useful, but California was, by the way. So there were great expectations that there will be additional land for settlement. But, this Mexican cession also fueled a national debate in the United States, precisely because the issue of slavery was at stake. In other words, so are we going to actually move slavery there or not? That was the question. And even before the war ended in 1846, when it was a sure sign that Mexico was going to surrender, there were already northern congressmen that were coming forth in Congress proposing legislation to prohibit the expansion of slavery in the Mexican cession. For example, David Wilmot from Pennsylvania introduced a bill called the Whitmore Proviso in 1846. He's an abolitionist, by the way. He wants to abolish slavery. He's convinced that slavery is a moral wrong, etc. And he's proposing this bill, and there's going to be a vote. And so it didn't have enough numbers. Okay, enough support, enough votes in Congress to actually pass it. But the fact that now Northern congressmen were actually proposing legislation to limit the expansion of slavery, that was again something that started conflict in the halls of Congress. It fueled animosities in Washington D.C., in Congress, in the halls of Congress, and people are already engaged in very heated arguments, heated discussions and debates. And there's a state of mistrust. Northern and Southern congressmen are now, distrust each other. They're carrying guns and so on to Congress. And very soon there's going to be actually physical violence, as we'll see, fist fights, etc. Just shortly, that actually happened, the fist fights, etc., when the territory of California, which was really the best, territory actually of the Mexican cession, applied for statehood as a free state. The settlers of California, they're sending a petition saying we want to join the Union, but we want a free constitution. We don't want slavery here, in other words. And of course, Southern congressmen were totally crushed to learn this, because they saw the Mexican cession in the South. Again, that the Mexican cession was in the southern portion of the continental landmass again, and so they kind of took it for granted that, well, all of this territory, since it's in the South, of course we're gonna have entitlements to move our slaves there. Now the people of California are rejecting again slavery by their own choice, and instead of taking up a vote, again, Southerners and Northerners in Congress, those representatives and senators, began to fight. So as they trying to take a vote whether to allow California to come in as a free state, that turned into a fist fight, a brawl in the halls of Congress, and they're starting to fight. They're really again using physical violence. They're hitting each other. In many cases, they're challenging each other to duels. In other words, they want to go outside and settle their offenses, their disputes by fighting in a duel. In other words, facing one-to-one, taking steps, drawing their guns, and shooting each other, etc. Like the old way again of settling disputes between quote-unquote gentlemen. So this is now again escalating. The violence is escalating by now, to the point that because there's no negotiation, there's no middle ground, there's no compromise. Southern congressmen, there's some of them, not all of them, but there were some of them that are actually calling already for secession. They were known as the fire eaters. The fire eaters were the secessionists. They were congressmen from the South that wanted secession. They wanted to withdraw from the Union. They saw no future, in the United States, because they saw sure signs that the country was already, at least the North, was already moving away from slavery, and they wanted to take away their slaves. So they said, why don't you just call for a vote? They met in Nashville, Tennessee, pretty much convoked all of the representatives from the southern states, the slaveholding states, to meet in this convention in Nashville, Tennessee in 1850 to take a vote for secession. That's 10 years early, again, 10 years earlier than when this actually happened. Okay, so 10 years before the South seceded from the Union, there was already meetings and conventions again held, like in Tennessee, for example, to actually do it. That's how fast again the country was coming apart on the issue of slavery regarding the Western territories. As the country is moving westward, the issue of slavery is going to divide the country. And of course, to settle really the country, to pretty much pacify both sides, there was another compromise. This is the last compromise, that was created by the oldest generation. They were the oldest members of Congress, like John C. Calhoun and Henry Clay, who back in the War of 1812, they were known as the nationalists, in other words. They were now very old, by the way, and many of them actually participated in the Missouri Compromise of 1820. They were the ones, that said, we need to save the Union. We need to preserve the Union because it's breaking apart. So what the Compromise of 1850 did, among other things, there were many different terms, by the way, that granted concessions to the South and the North. But what really was to solve the issue of the Western territories in terms of slavery. In other words, how we're going to actually bring in new states from the Western territories that are going to be free or slave. Again, the compromise was that, Congress is not going to decide on that. In other words, congressmen cannot agree. So let the people decide. People are going to, in the Western territories, when they are applying for statehood in any territory, when there are 60,000 inhabitants, they're going to have to hold an election. They take a vote and vote whether they want to live in a free state or slave state. In other words, it's called popular sovereignty. In other words, the will of the people, okay, is going to decide on that. Not senators, not representatives, but turn the issue to the people, because the people decide. It's called popular sovereignty, right? The will of the people, people's rule, in other words. Okay, so whatever they decide, that will be done. So what that meant is that now all of the territories of the West are, open to the possibility for slavery to expand, because that's what people will decide. Again, it's up to the people, in other words. So even in the Nebraska territory that was supposed to be free, given to the North by the Missouri Compromise of 1820, all of this territory is now going to be open, for slavery. Unless the people that moved there vote, against it, that's fine. But so what that did is that created a land rush in which both sides were trying to move in people as quickly as possible, okay, into the West in order to organize a territory, either to be a slave or free state. So people from New York and Pennsylvania actually moved a lot of people into a new territory. They're going to create a new territory called Kansas. And also there were people from Virginia and Georgia and Missouri that began to also move people into Kansas as well. So what that meant is that both the North and the South were trying to move in people there to settle this territory. So by the time the elections will come, then they're going to have to vote either in favor or against. So they have to move as many people as possible. And so in 1854, the Kansas territory is now ready to hold an election. And so in Congress, they actually detach this territory. They created now the territory of Kansas. It's called the Kansas and Nebraska Act of 1854, in order to actually grant this territory the status now of a territory that was now moving into statehood, and the way that was going to happen is by the Kansas settlers to hold an election in which those settlers will have to vote, what kind of constitution they want. They want a free constitution or slave constitution, okay? And so once again, Kansas belonged initially under the Missouri Compromise, in the Nebraska territory that was supposed to be free, according to the Compromise of 1820. But now, even this territory could potentially be turned into a series of slave states if the elections turned in favor, again, of slavery. And that's exactly what is going to happen here. In 1855, there's going to be elections, but because the settlers that favor slavery were not enough, in other words, there were more settlers in Kansas that wanted Kansas to be free. Because of that, then days, perhaps even weeks before the elections, the state of Missouri, the slave state, the neighboring state of Missouri, actually sent about 5,000 people to cross the border into Kansas in order to vote, in order to cast their vote in favor of slavery. Those were not Kansas residents. What it was reported is that, days and even weeks before the election, there was just waves and waves of people coming over. Many of them were actually outlaws, by the way. They were known as the border ruffians, they were called. Border ruffians were, outlaws, people with, criminal records, etc., very violent individuals and so on. And they're coming in to intimidate, of course, the people there. And, once the election is held, they're going to cast thousands, about 5,000 of phony votes, okay? And obviously, those are not actually residents there, so they just voted and they're going to leave, of course. But what that did is that both sides claimed victory at the end. Both sides, the pro-slavery and the anti-slavery factions, actually announced that they won the election. Okay, so we're going to see then the creation of two governments. Two different cities, capital cities, were created. Each side chose one city to be the capital, the seat of the Kansas government, and they wrote their own constitutions. One was a slave constitution, and the other one was a free constitution. For example, in Lacampton, the pro-slavery faction actually chose Lacampton, the town of Lacampton, to be the seat of the Kansas government, and they wrote a pro-slavery constitution, and they said, we are, okay, the official legitimate authority, the seat of the government of Kansas again. We are the government, in other words, of Kansas. And in Topeka, this other town, the free settlers that wanted a free constitution set up a government there. They wrote a constitution to make slavery illegal and so on. And they said, no, we are the legitimate government because we won the election. In other words, this popular sovereignty. This is what the people, this is what the people decided. They want to live in a free state. So Kansas is free. Okay. In 1856. And so what happens is that because there were thousands of border ruffians, as they were called, border ruffians, those were, very, very, antisocial individuals, outlaws and so on. Those 5,000 individuals started up really raiding the settlers of Kansas. They started really attacking their towns and settlements and so on, and they went to Topeka as well and created, of course, a series of riots, and they were shooting people, etc. And violence broke out now. So people are actually now fighting in Kansas, in the Kansas territory. The settlers are fighting each other now. The pro-slavery and the anti-slavery factions are now fighting in 1856. And this is 4 years before the Civil War started. Americans are already fighting in the West over land, over territories, over the issue of slavery again. So again, territorial expansion is also extremely important for the country coming apart. Okay, as Americans are moving west, they're going to be, fighting over slavery. Okay, like in Kansas, there's already fighting, okay, taking place. The third reason why the Civil War came about as well, besides sectionalism and territorial expansion, it was a movement, actually. It's called the abolitionist movement. In the 1830s and 40s, we're going to see in the United States now the coming about of a massive popular movement that is taking place, particularly and more strongly in the upper states in the North. Okay, and it's called the abolitionist movement. So, what is the abolitionist movement? Well, it is really a movement in which the participants, the activists, are trying to bring in the Constitution an amendment. They want an amendment in the Constitution to prohibit slavery in the country, to bring it to an end. In other words, to make it illegal, okay, to end all forms of slavery in the United States, whether it's the slave trade or slave markets or bondage, all forms, again, of slavery, to make them illegal in the Constitution. Now, of course, there's already an opposition to slavery, in the country because of economics. In other words, the North looks at slavery as an impediment for economic progress, in other words. So from an economic standpoint, the North sees slavery as killing jobs and, not allowing the flourishing of more businesses because of limits consumerism in the United States and so on. So we talked about that quite extensively. But now, starting in the 1830s and 40s, what we're going to see is that many Northerners are now using religion to oppose slavery. So it was not just economics. Economics is important, but in the North, they're now using religion to oppose slavery. And really, the abolitionist movement that I'm about to discuss was in many cases fueled by religious ideas. So this was a kind of like a religious movement of sorts. Even though it's totally political, again, the abolitionist movement is trying to change laws in the country, of course. But the driving force, the engine of the abolitionist movement is, religion, religious ideas. Because the abolitionist movement was actually a byproduct of a religious revivalist movement that we talked about in the previous topic, the Second Great Awakening. Okay, that spanned roughly, from 1830 to 1845. That 15-year period is called the Second Great Awakening in the U.S. It's a revival, it's a religious revival. That was centered on prophecy, by the way. Okay, it was a prophetic movement in which religious organizations and churches and so on in the United States were convinced that the second coming of Christ was imminent. It was about to happen in their lifetime, okay, anytime soon. In the Second Great Awakening, the revivalists believed that in order to get society ready for the second coming of Christ, it was essential to purify society, to purify the social institutions, to purify what they call the soul of America, in other words, and that what was really the greatest sin holding America back from entering this new Christian era that Christ was about to initiate was slavery. They said this is the greatest sin of all, even far greater than any other ill, that we face in society, like poverty or alcoholism or, you look around and, they said nothing compares, again, to the sin of slavery. So there's a religious tone now that Northerners are using to attack slavery. And it's not just that economically it's not, it's not allowing the economy to grow. It's just that it's a sin, it's a moral wrong. It goes against the teachings of Christ. Okay? And of course, this is something that we have seen really goes back to the colonial period. The Puritans and the Quakers already had rejected slavery since the very beginning. But now, because there's a religious revival, the revivalists are trying to abolish slavery. Because they said, Christ is about to return, so we need to really get going in trying to reform the country, liberate the slaves, in other words. And of course, there's going to be abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison. He is from Boston, Massachusetts. Has a Puritan background. He was part of the Second Great Awakening. And he was really one of the first abolitionists, again, to promote abolitionist ideas on a massive scale. He opened up a newspaper called The Liberator, in which he published, of course, a series of articles constantly, again, attacking slavery and slave owners. Really placing slavery as as barbaric, as a moral wrong, as a sin, and that it was important to redeem, the soul of America, he called, to redemption. He says, purify our soul from a lot centuries of wrongdoing and sinning, in other words. So there's a religious tone. And so his newspaper will have a larger and greater, of course, audience, not only within Massachusetts, but all across New England and across the North and all the Northeast. Again, William Lloyd Garrison will become very well known, again, for being really one of the forerunners of the abolitionist movement. But once again, he's criticizing slavery from a religious standpoint now, okay? And there will be another very important abolitionist as well that is going to also have a great impact in the abolitionist movement, and the African-American Frederick Douglass. Again, in 1841, he actually published a book that talked about his own personal life, his upbringing, and so on, as a slave, as an escaped slave, actually, from Maryland. He was born and raised a slave in Maryland, but at a young age, he escaped the plantation. He escaped Maryland altogether. He moved up north. He became highly educated. He had really a brilliant mind, by the way. And he'll become very well known in the North for his abolitionist speeches, in which he was actually talking about, how slaves lived in the South, how they were treated, what kind of functions they played, again, in the South, and so on. In other words, back then, because there were very limited communication systems, it was not very well understood, how slaves lived in the South. If you lived in the North, it existed, okay? You knew very well, but people just didn't have a first-hand, experience with it. So Frederick Douglass is going to be instrumental in pretty much communicating to the North, to Northerners, to thousands and thousands of Northerners, to communicating exactly how slaves actually lived. So people are going to learn about it, from a person that actually went through this, So the significance of this is that he's going to pretty much shatter all misconceptions, again, about the institution that people held around this time, particularly the conception of slave owners as being, like the father figures, of the slaves, that they treated the slaves rather humanely because the slave owner was like a father, a protector that was guiding the slaves properly and to become, good Christians, to save their souls and so on, so they can also, enter the age of civilization and so on. That they were actually taking care of them, in other words, that this was, a humane kind of institution. So what he was actually suggesting, again, is that, all of this is just, not true. So Frederick Douglass was actually questioning that, and of course, contradicting, of course, that idea that, that slavery in the South was more about, exploitation, again. So again, this is something very revealing, very telling, again, that many Northerners are going to now become far more conscious of. Okay, so he was very instrumental in raising consciousness in the North, consciousness about the issue of slavery, how slaves were treated, and the like. So, the abolitionism as such gained a lot of sympathizers. A lot of people sympathized with the abolitionist cause that they were trying to end slavery. And that led to, of course, many Northerners, perhaps thousands of them, actually participating in something called the Underground Railroad. Again, what is the Underground Railroad? Well, yeah, it were actually Northerners who actually provided refuge to escaped slaves fleeing the South. So slaves that were fleeing the South, they had to move up north, by the way, because they will be helped by Northerners in certain places. In other words, it was very well known which houses, for example, which farms were providing refuge to escaped slaves as they were trying to flee and move all the way to the north as much as possible, perhaps even moving into Canada. Because in Canada, again, there was no slavery practice there altogether. So they were trying to run away from the United States at that point, pretty much flee the country. And of course, Northerners were, aiding them. Okay, it's called the Underground Railroad. They were moved from one house to another, to another, to another, until they would pretty much find some form of safe haven in Canada at that point. There were many trails, many networks, again, of the Underground Railroad, by the way. And so that, of course, angered Southerners because this movement, called the abolitionist movement, was really now gaining more and more support. That there were, ordinary people, civilians, that were actually aiding, slaves escape. And they were losing, of course, a lot of, so-called, investment, a lot of property, in 1830, there were about 500 slaves escaping every year, 500 going up north, the vast majority. By 1860, on the eve of the Civil War, there were about 1,000 slaves were actually escaping and moving up north. Okay, so this is something that Southerners are growing extremely exasperated about, because now the North is actually helping again their slaves escape. They're protecting them, they're feeding, they're providing refuge like water and clothing, food, medicine, and so on, so they can continue their journey all the way up north. So the abolitionist movement, however, is not going to simply, be a sort of benevolent, movement, and that simply promoted the ideas of liberty, for example, to liberate the slaves and so on, which, of course, the bulk of the abolitionist movement was very benign, very benevolent. But of course, within this movement, there will be individuals who took those ideas to the extreme, all the way to the extreme, and they became extremists, in other words, very radical abolitionists who now believe, particularly as we move into the 1850s, that it was actually their mission, to liberate the slaves by force, by using violence, because they believed that this was something that God was telling them to do. So again, it's religious fanaticism that we call, today. This is a form of religious fanaticism or extremism, in which, again, people use religion or religious ideas to validate or support violent actions to advance a political cause. A political cause. In this case, your political cause is abolish slavery, and you feel that the only way to do it is through violence, and people feel justified to use that violence because they feel that they're doing God's work. So because what I believe they said is good, is Christian, is something that my religion tells me that is good. This is God's laws and so on, Christ's teachings. So therefore, we had to actually go against those that contradict God's law, those that violate God's laws as well. And so more and more, individuals are beginning to portray, slave owners, in this case, as actually, be Satan's agents, in other words. Because when you reach that extreme, that extreme level of thought, in which you see that you are on the side of goodness, that you hold the right perspective because you hold a religious, viewpoint, and therefore those that don't share your viewpoints and actually do the opposite, as a matter of fact, that they must be the devil, in other words. Not that they're ignorant or that they're wrong or they're, confused. No, is that they're the devil, in other words, or they're possessed by the devil, or they're Satan's agents, and so on. Again, so again, this is religious extremism. Again, and that exactly again happened back in this time, particularly when we study, for example, John Brown, an abolitionist, very deeply religious. He was coming from the Second Great Awakening, again, of the revivalist, movement, and he became an abolitionist, convinced that slavery was preventing, the second coming of Christ. Okay, and he began to. He claims that he started hearing the voices in his head, which for him it was the voice of God. So he said, "I'm hearing the voice of God in my head, telling him to start a religious war in Kansas." When there was elections in Kansas, that we see the creation of two Kansas. Northerners were very, very crushed, to learn that there's now, of course, people fighting there, that the pro-slavery faction was trying to spread slavery into Kansas, that Kansas should be free. And so John Brown, in this case, claimed to hear the voice of God telling him to go to Kansas and to, let me just put it the way, he expressed this. Again, I'm just using, what historians have written about this. In other words, he heard the voice of God telling him to go to Kansas and kill as many slave owners as possible. Okay, so because this is a religious war now, in other words, so he went to Kansas with a group of people. Many of them were his own sons and other friends, also religious extremists, to Kansas to start now murdering slave owners or people that sympathize or supported the cause of slavery. They will knock on somebody's home. They will knock on the door, and as soon as somebody opened the door, they will just murder that person there, right there and then. Of course, he first identified, the houses of all of the pro-slavery families, those that own slaves, and so on. And he was going house by house doing this. It was brutal. It was barbaric, what he was actually doing. Because he did not ask any questions. Whoever opened the door, he'll just murder again. So it was really now, a mess. In Kansas, there's now a kind of a religious war on the rise as well because of the abolitionist movement. And after that, he turned his attention now to Virginia. He claims that he heard the voice of God as well, telling him to now go to Virginia, another slave state, okay, to start a slave revolution, okay, in Virginia. Okay, so he took his followers to Virginia and to a fort, a military fort or garrison that was very well known for containing one of the largest warehouses for arms and weapons and gunpowder, etc. So what he wanted is to steal some of those weapons and arm the slaves, in other words. Okay, that was his idea. So it was not even his idea. He claimed that's what God was telling him to do, by the way. Okay, so that's again, that's what he claims. So again, he's going to be surrounded. He's going to be actually captured. His plan failed altogether, and he's going to be tried for treason, and he's going to be sentenced to death. And so even before he was actually executed, he gave a speech there in that he was trying to justify his actions as legitimate because he was doing God's will, God's work, and pretty much, because he's going to be hanged in Virginia, a slave state, he pretty much started really accusing all of the people there, the authorities and everybody else, as sinners, that they were actually violating the commandments and God's law in the Bible, and that the country, the United States, was going to actually suffer a great catastrophe, he said, because of the sin of slavery. That this sin was going to be redeemed, but it will be at the very great cost of, again, of a lot of blood, that will be shed. And so after that, he'll be, of course, hanged afterwards. Now, the significance of this is that, in the North, the death of John Brown was actually commemorated with a moment of silence. People lowered the flag. They observed, what they called the fall of a hero. He was a martyr that died for a lofty cause. Northerners were actually paying homage to John Brown as a hero and not as a religious fanatic. So, this actually celebration, this homage that the North paid to John Brown was really, again, what convinced Southerners that the abolitionist movement had gone too far, that the North was already, again, bordering on madness, that this cause was not a just cause. It was actually a fanatical movement, in other words, that there's fanatics. Those are religious fanatics that are now using violence to impose their political viewpoint. And they're celebrating actually John Brown, who they call a madman, who was actually murdering families in Kansas. So, what kind of hero is that? In other words, of course, so this is going to really push the South even further and further, again, away, in that Southerners felt that there's no negotiation again. We're not going to be able to solve our differences, with the North, because now they're not listening. They're simply, again, fanatical about the issue of slavery. They're now totally, they have lost their minds, in other words, okay? So that's very important. The abolitionist movement is really tearing the fabric of society apart, even though, in principle, the movement, of course, holds very, very lofty ideals, the idea of liberty, freedom for all human beings, and so on, condemning bondage, and so on. So in principle, of course, the ideas are very, very virtuous, but there were groups that were now using violence pretty much to justify their action, because they felt that they were actually on the right side of the argument, not because they thought about it, but because they felt that God actually was on their side as well. Okay, and I'm on God's side, so yeah, I can actually engage in violence, because the other side are just like, they're devils or Satan, etc. Okay, so very important. Now, the fourth cause that led to the Civil War was actually that Americans are going to divide themselves also over political parties. The country will be divided sharply again, right down the middle again, between two political parties. One political party is going to represent the North, and the other political party is going to represent the South again. And so once we see a divided nation politically, that is also going to be another cause for understanding, why the country is going to be split apart, and how political parties are going to represent the interest of two different geographical regions that will go to war again after 1860. Okay, so in the South, what happened is that Southerners realized that the best way to protect their interest, to protect, in this case, slavery, to prevent the North from changing the Constitution, from taking away their slaves, it was to actually use a political party and support that political party to win all elections at all levels, local, state, and federal. And in that way, when you have one party representing you, the South, the representatives, again, of the South in that party holding office are going to pretty much block any legislation, any bill that will take away slavery. So they decided that that political party was going to be the Democratic Party. Southern planters, Southern slave owners, and Southerners as a whole thought that the most obvious choice was to use the Democratic Party, because by tradition, the Democratic Party has been the party of the South. It was created by a Southerner, Thomas Jefferson, the Virginian, and James Madison, to represent the ideas of life, liberty, and property. So the South already voted Democrat by tradition, and now they're going to use, again, that party to represent the South in terms of slavery. Because they said, well, life, liberty, and property, those are the ideals of democracy. So we're going to use that party to represent, the views, the interests of the South, particularly slavery. Because property is life, liberty, and property. And property, again, is sacred. Okay? What we're saying by voting Democrat is that we have the right to own property. That the states in the South have the right to own property. And since slaves are a form of property, then nobody can take away my property, that is to say. That's why I'm going to vote Democrat, because that's what democracy means, they said. Okay? And so the South, starting in the 1840s, is going to vote exclusively now 100% Democrat. Only because that party, from that point onwards, was the party of slavery. In other words, if you vote Democrat, it's because you're voting for, slavery. Now, that meant that those that voted Democrat in the northern states, they're not going to be voting Democrat anymore, after 1840, because that is the party of slavery now. So, in the North, what we're going to see is that Americans are now, in the upper states, are now trying to create their own parties, many of whom were actually abolitionist parties. Okay, and there's going to be different kinds of parties arising in the 1830s, again, that are now trying to create an organization, again, to represent the views, the interests of the North. Like, for example, the Whig Party, the Party of Manufacturers. This is a party of manufacturers from the Northeast called the Whig Party. They're against slavery, for economic reasons as well. Industries cannot expand because there's slaves, they don't earn wages, etc. There's the Free Soil Party of Northern farmers. Northern farmers create their own party to represent Northern farmers that wanted a free soil in the West. Okay, they wanted to close the doors to slavery moving westward, a free soil. And there's a party of the middle class and intellectuals, the Liberty Party, that wanted, of course, a party to represent the ideals of liberty. And so they said, we need to be a nation, again, in which we represent liberty, but we cannot actually represent that to the world when we have slaves. It's inconsistent. And again, as we move into the 1850s, those three parties are going to merge, because the South, was really now using one party, the Democratic Party, to represent slavery. So by 1854, all of those three parties that I mentioned, the Whigs, the Free Soil, and the Liberty, are going to merge and create a grand party, again, what they call the Republican Party. Again, in 1854, they unite forces. They said, well, we need to come together, because now we have to also create a party that represents the North. So why be divided now? So let's come together and join forces and actually push for the abolition of slavery. And again, so this is an abolitionist party. The Republican Party that was born in 1854 was composed of farmers, manufacturers, the middle class. They're coming together, but, they're share one common denominator. They share one goal in common, is that no matter, what background we come from, okay, it doesn't matter. We all agree that in order to create the ideal society in the United States, slavery needs to go. Okay, first and foremost, whether you want a nation of farmers or manufacturers, that doesn't matter. We all agree that slavery is an obstacle to create this ideal society. Okay, so this is extremely important, because now the country is sharply divided politically. We got a Democratic South and now a Republican North. Okay, and again, if you live in the North, you're going to vote Republican, because if you vote Democrat, you're voting for slavery. In other words, there's no interest again in that issue. Again, the Democratic Party will be now a one single issue party. In other words, it's really fostering slavery and the perpetuation of the institution in the future as well. So as we approach the presidential election of 1860, the Republican Party is going to nominate one of the most renowned abolitionist speakers in the United States at this point, Abraham Lincoln. He was a politician from Illinois. He was part of the Second Great Awakening, by the way. He lived in he was actually young in the 30s and 40s. He was shaped by that religious revival. The views of slavery. Again, he became a convert to abolitionism. He was convinced that it was a sin, was a moral wrong. He was actually raised as a Quaker, by the way, in Illinois. His family instilled in him Quaker values that informed him that slavery, again, was a sin. And so he was convinced that the time had come for the United States to abolish slavery. So he was giving a series of speeches, all across the North. And because he was very popular, very well known, he was nominated as the natural candidate for the presidency of 1860. Abraham Lincoln, again, is going to now be nominated by the Republican Party to actually bring the end to slavery. All right. So, the Republican Party presented in the presidential election of 1860, again, a platform. So, again, what is a platform? Okay, in this case. Sorry about that. Okay, so what is a platform? So, a platform is really, again, a series of goals that the party pursued, like policies, in other words. This is our policy proposals, our policy goals, something that we want to introduce in the country, to change the country, to shape it, to mold it in a specific way. Okay? This is what we're presenting to the public, so the public can, know what we represent, so they can vote for us or not vote for us. So the Republican Party presented an anti-slavery platform. All of the policies of the Republican Party in 1860 was really an anti-slavery program, declaring slavery as immoral. In other words, we hereby declare slavery to be immoral. Is not consistent with, the ideas of liberty and so on, so forth, that come in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and the like. Again, so they're trying to say, if you go back to our founding, this nation was supposed to be created again for peoples that believed again in natural rights like liberty, for example, like life, liberty, and property, isn't it? So we're supposed to be a nation again of people that actually honors liberty. But again, slavery is preventing that. So it actually is a party that is going to also work to prohibit the expansion of slavery into all the Western territories. So in other words, the party is going to, prohibit the expansion of slavery across the West, and is going to force the ultimate extinction of slavery in the Constitution. In other words, if we, win the presidency or win seats in Congress, we're going to abolish slavery, in other words, in the Constitution. So Southerners viewed the Republican Party, they already have one, it's called the Democratic Party. They have a party to represent their own interests, but now they see this newly created party arising in the North called the Republican Party, not as an ordinary political party, but they see the Republican Party as a revolutionary organization that is trying to initiate a revolution, in other words. Now, what they don't want is reform, they said, okay? They want a revolution. Southern planters, Southern interests said that, okay? Because this party, by bringing about the end of slavery, was going to bring radical change, drastic, radical change to the way of life, to the Southern way of life. In other words, this party is threatening our own way of life. What is the Southern way of life? Well, remember, this is an agricultural society, okay? The South had been an agricultural society going back to the colonies, in the early colonial period.
Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia. It's an agricultural setting, an agrarian setting in which people are pretty much living the life of in the countryside. For the most part, people live in the countryside. They have their own farms. They're growing their own crops. They live in small nested communities, farming communities again. And they follow traditions. They follow the traditions of their forefathers, the way they're supposed to behave, the way that people are supposed to behave in society, how people are supposed to treat women, for example, how people treat each other, and so on. Again, they have their own norms, their own moral codes, and so on, and they don't want change. We don't want to modernize. We don't want to live in big cities and all that. So we want to continue all rural setting. Countryside. Type of living, in other words. Okay. And of course, the other thing is that Southerners are saying that this Republican Party, by threatening to abolish slavery, that this is also going to end this aristocratic culture that has existed in the South. That, the planter class was really like an aristocracy, a landed elite that had serfs. Like in Europe, back in Europe, when there was an aristocracy in Europe, in the Middle Ages, now you got a nobility, people that, claim, connections back to noble families that have inherited land and certain privileges. For example, the privileges to not only own the land, but also to have serfs or servants, in other words. So that's how Southern planters see themselves, like aristocrats. In many cases, they grant themselves titles of nobility, calling themselves like barons, etc. Like nobility. So this culture was going to come to an end. If they lose their slaves, it's almost like they're taking away your status of an aristocrat again. So again, that's the way of life. This is the way of life. They live in mansions, in the South, with lavish, luxuries and lifestyles and so on. That all of that was going to come to an end. Okay, the planter class, and of course, that by taking away their slaves, they were also going to be, losing their property rights. That they're going to violate my property rights, which is really capital investment I have. Many of them actually have large debts that needed to be repaid to financial institutions in the South, in which the collateral, the guarantee of those loans that they obtained were actually in the form of slaves. In other words, their slaves were held as collateral by the banks of the South for those planters to pay back loans, in other words. So if you take away my slaves, you're going to affect, again, my financial status in the South, and I'm not going to be able to pay back my loans. I need that labor, and also that labor is held by the financial institution as a form of security. So it threatened the entire fabric, the financial fabric of the South. Okay, so the Democratic Party in the South nominated Stephen Douglas to run against Lincoln. He was a Democrat, of course, pro-slavery, but his campaign was not very open, supporting slavery. He was not really coming out saying, yeah, I hereby support slavery. He campaigned on the issue of popular sovereignty. In other words, look, it's up to the people to decide whether they want to live in a free state or not. So what I'm saying here is that, I don't support abolitionism, like Lincoln. I actually just support what is called popular sovereignty. Let the people decide, what kind of country, what kind of state they want to live in. This election, the presidential election of 1860, was really a sectional election. So what does it mean? What does it mean to, sectional election? That this election really was divided down the middle, exactly at the very middle, in that one section, the North, is going to vote all of it Republican, and the other section, the South, are going to vote Democrat. That sharply divided, again, how the election is going to be like. It's a sectional election. Down the middle, one section voted for one party, the other section voted for the other party. Okay, the southern states, because they have less population, okay, they have 9 million people. The north had about 15 million people. So by default, that means that the south has less electoral votes. In other words, in the electoral college. So if the entire north is going to vote Republican, well, they're going to win the election because they had all the electoral votes they need. Okay, so they were threatening, to secede from the Union even before the election was held. Okay, they were coming out saying, well, if Lincoln wins, we're going to actually leave the Union. And one of the ways they attempted to actually prevent Lincoln's, election was by actually erasing the name Lincoln in the ballots in the South. You had no other option, to vote other than Democrat. Only Stephen Douglas appeared on the ballot. Even the name Lincoln did not appear there, just to make sure that every Southerner voted, again, Democrat. But even then, even with that strategy, Lincoln won the presidency, because he had the majority of the population living, in the North. So they won the election, fair and square. So that brings us then to part 2, the coming and process of the Civil War from 1860 to 65. Again, this is going to be a very condensed, discussion of the coming and process of the Civil War. Okay, so we already finished looking at the causes. Now let's look again. What really are the immediate factors that are now going to, again, ignite a war? Because so far there's only been, again, an election that is going to immediately after Lincoln's victory is announced, the South is going to announce that they're leaving, secession. Again, they're seceding from the Union, and the crisis of secession. Lincoln's election of 1860. This is the only presidential election that has caused a war in the United States, by the way. It was his election. And the slave states, because they perceived the initiation of a revolution, they said, what we're witnessing here, again, is the beginning of a revolution coming from the North, a northern revolution. To counter this revolution, to prevent there will be a revolution in the South, to prevent any change, what we need to do is secede, leave the Union. Again, so South Carolina was the first one to initiate this motion, holding, of course, conventions in their state legislatures and calling for a vote for secession. And South Carolina is going to be dragging along other slave states along with her, of course, state after state again. Eventually, there'll be a total of 11 states that seceded from the Union, a grand total, again, of 11 states that seceded from the Union and created not a country, but an alliance. Again, an alliance. They created an alliance of slave states that they called the Confederate States of America, or the Confederacy. Remember, a confederacy is an alliance. That's what it is. Again, it's an alliance of slave states. Okay, and they, are not yet at war. Again, there's not going to be, now fighting. It's just Lincoln comes into office and the entire South is leaving. Okay, and South Carolina started this motion to secede. So there's no war yet, there's no fighting. But now let's look at what actually caused a declaration of war. Well, the declaration of war occurred when there was an issue, of course, at stake that needed to be solved. And the issue was, of course, the issue of federal forts. There's a series of federal forts in the South that are still occupied by federal forces. But now those states in the South claim that those forts are no longer federal, that they're part of the state. And they want all the personnel, those officers, to leave, in other words, to go back to the North, in other words, because they said this is an independent, country here. Okay, this is not the United States anymore. Okay, so it was actually South Carolina that actually attacked one of those forts. It was called Fort Sumter in 1861. because the personnel refused to live there. The personnel actually requested supplies. They were running out of food and water and so on. And as the ship was approaching to the fort, it was called Fort Sumter, to resupply that federal fort, South Carolina actually opened fire, of course, and attacked, of course, the federal ships that were approaching, and in the process they also attacked the fort as well. So it was South Carolina that initiated really the war. It was the spark of the war, South Carolina's attack on Fort Sumter in 1861. And of course, Lincoln, as he comes in, and he sees the situation now that there's now a war, coming into being. There were many, people that were presenting different options there. In other words, there were people that says, you just have to let the South go. There were Northerners that says, the South, there's no way we can actually change the way they think, etc. They're just so different from us. This is useless. Just let them go. In other words, okay. There were others that wanted to save the Union. There were other Americans that says, no, what we need to do is save the Union and bring the South back, in other words. So Lincoln was faced with that, of course, dilemma, and he wanted to save the Union. He was a firm believer in the Union in the United States, and as he comes in as president, he says, no, let's save the Union. Okay, so for this reason, the North is going to be known as the Union. Okay, they're fighting for the Union. Initially, this is the main goal, the main objective, again, of Lincoln's administration is, I'm fighting for the Union, to save the Union. So Lincoln's forces, the Northern forces, will be known as the Union forces, the Union Army. Okay. So once again, this is, Fort Sumter, this is in Charleston Harbor. This is Fort Sumter. This is the place that South Carolina, of course, attacked. That led to really the spark, again, of the conflict. And when that, of course, occurred, now the whole country is now moving into, again, a new conflict. We already, kind of covered Lincoln sending supplies to Fort Sumter and South Carolina attacking Fort Sumter again. So Lincoln declares war on the Confederacy, and now there will be additional states that seceded and that will join now the Confederacy: Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas. After Lincoln declared war on the Confederacy, there will be, again, an additional 4 states that are going to secede, and they're going to place the capital in Richmond, Virginia. Richmond, Virginia will become now the capital of the Confederacy. And once again, the reasons for fighting the war. The Confederacy claimed that they were fighting for what they call states' rights. So what exactly are they talking about? Again, in reality, everything boiled down to one issue: is the right to property. Okay, the right to protect their property, and in this case, most specifically, they're talking about slavery. In other words, so that's what actually the Confederacy is talking about here. Okay, the North, on the other hand, or the Union, initially was to restore the Union, to prevent secession and bring the South back and restore the Union, and also to prevent the nationalization of slavery. This is very important, how Northerners are also very committed, again, to this issue, that the war also for them meant that what they were trying to accomplish is the expansion of slavery across the country, in a point that it was going to be pervasive and legal everywhere, what they called the nationalization of slavery. They perceived that slavery was becoming now national. It was going national, at this point. It was expanding all over in the Western territories, and even slave owners were moving up north with their own slaves and so on. Again, it was really becoming a national problem. So they said, we need to save the Union, and we need to also prevent the nationalization of slavery. Okay, so here, we're not going to be paying attention to all of the issues. Okay, battles, campaigns, and people marching here and there, etc. But rather, I would like just to provide a very quick analysis, a synthesis of why the Confederacy is going to lose. Okay, the weaknesses of the Confederacy. Okay, just to understand, why they lost the war and what kind of policies Lincoln implemented that enabled the Union to ultimately defeat the Confederacy. Okay, so let's go one by one. Again, the weaknesses of the Confederacy, first and foremost, is that because they did not have a centralized government that controlled all of the states, but every state was pretty much independent. This is an alliance of independent states. So therefore, they were unable to raise funds, through taxes, that there were no revenues collected from each of the states. So there was a centralized authority that was coordinating the finances, for example, of all of those southern states to pay for the expenses of the war. Again, only the states could tax their own people. So therefore, this is going to be, an issue that is going to cost them the war, the inability to raise funds through taxes, for example. That's number one. Also, that they're not going to have a grand, unified Confederate army, okay, in which all of the states, all the Confederate states actually supplied soldiers, again, for this grand Confederate army to fight as a single unified force. Every state was fighting the war on their own terms, and they were only really defending their own borders, their own territory. So Texas only defended Texas, Virginians defended Virginia, South Carolina defended South Carolina, etc. Again, so it was very, very fragmented. Okay, and the Union Army was all totally unified. It was all together. It was unified under a single leadership. So it was better coordinated than the South. That was very, very fragmented. Okay, another weakness is the lack of sufficient crop consumption agriculture, because the South pretty much use all their energies, all their resources to grow one crop. Okay, cotton. Okay, most of the good land was actually seized by planters to grow cotton, king cotton. Okay, and yes, it's true there are farmers. There's a class of small farmers. In the South, but they're only growing their own food. Okay, so where is the food then coming from in the South? Prior to the Civil War, the South was actually importing food from northern farmers. It was importing wheat and corn and other products from the Ohio Valley. That was the breadbasket of the United States. Northern farmers were feeding the South. But now northern farmers are in the Union. So they're not going to send any more food to the South. So the South, because it lacked crop consumption agriculture like wheat and corn, eventually they're going to face a food crisis. By 1863, there were sure signs that the Confederacy was disintegrating because people were scrambling for food. There were food riots. They were looting stores and so on in order to get a hold of any food. Again, so this is very, very important. Okay, so this is going to be, very essential for actually, for even the Confederate forces, that they're going to be actually, also facing drastic shortages, food shortages as well. Okay, also that the South was ill-equipped technologically because they did not invest in technology like in the North. They're pretty much fighting now a superior technological force, the Union. And so their transportation systems are inefficient. They have very limited railroads, for example. They have no factories. They have no industries to speak of. So they're not going to really deal, with the requirements of fighting a modern technological war. Now the Union is fighting, again, a war that is totally modern. They're using modern industries and railroads and so on to transport their forces and troops. There's another issue, again, technology. that's the downside of not having, not being able to modernize in the past, or they were not willing to do that. Now again is going to affect them, of course. So the Confederacy also, number 5, refused to use slaves for military purposes. They had, of course, 4.5 million slaves at their disposal. They could indeed perhaps use a certain portion of the slaves to train them to fight the Union, but because they're constantly afraid of what's called slave rebellion, they don't want to end up, with a situation in which they are going to train their own slaves and arm them, and then they're going to turn around, of course, and use now those weapons to free themselves, of course. So that's, for some historians, that was actually an error, that they had, of course, additional resources at their disposal, but they were not willing to use them. And of course, cotton. The Confederacy relied on cotton exports to finance the war. They said, we don't need anything. We don't even need taxes, because what we're going to do is simply, export cotton to Europe, and with those monies, we're actually going to pay for the war. But it's precisely when the war erupted that India and Egypt are now going to rival the U.S. South in cotton production. In other words, that the prices of cotton is going to start slowly coming down, because there's other 2 regions that are now mass producing cotton, and the British and the Europeans that need cotton are turning to India and Egypt instead for that cotton. So so you can keep your cotton, because we don't need it, in other words. So again, the South is not going to have those revenues, again, to pay for their expenses. Now, in terms of Lincoln implemented certain strategies to quickly bring about the defeat of the Confederacy very quickly. Again, we're not going to pay attention to everything that the Union did, except the most important, perhaps the most successful strategy, was a naval blockade of southern ports. That is to say that besides cotton, that Europeans were now buying cotton, particularly the British is now importing cotton from India and Egypt, that the South was unable to export it anywhere, because the North, Lincoln implemented a naval blockade of all the southern ports. In other words, the South was unable to ship out cotton because their ports were blockaded. So therefore, this is going to be very, very hard for the South to actually gain any revenues. We don't have any revenues coming in, because we cannot actually ship out that cotton anywhere for that matter. Okay, that's one. The other, of course, is that in 1863, Lincoln decided to issue an order to the Union generals fighting in the South to free the slaves. In other words, from now on, the mission of the war is that the generals fighting in the South, the soldiers, the Union Army, will have to free the slaves from the plantation. This was known as the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863. Again, as a proclamation to emancipate, to liberate the slaves. And this was really a wartime strategy. It was considered strategic, because what that will do is, take away one of the, greatest assets, again, that the Confederacy had. It was labor, the system of labor. The backbone of the Confederate economy was the slaves, because that labor was used to produce whatever little food was around. They were the ones building forts, mining some coal for the Confederacy. So if you free those slaves, the Confederacy will have to surrender, because they're not going to have that labor, in other words. Okay, so that was a practical side to that. And of course, the destruction of Southern infrastructure. In other words, what Lincoln said is to bring about the rapid surrender, again, of the Confederacy. Let's destroy any capacity for the South to wage war. It's called scorched earth policy. In other words, try to destroy anything that the South could potentially use to carry out war, particularly in the most rebellious states. Georgia and South Carolina are the most rebellious of all the states. And so to demoralize those states, destroy the railroad lines, plantations and crops, warehouses, barns, and so on. So they're not going to have any other option but surrender, in other words. So again, this was, something that General William Sherman, the Union General Sherman, was commissioned to do, the so-called March to the Sea. He started marching from Tennessee into Georgia, pretty much destroying all the rail lines there, going to Savannah, and then marching upward again to the north into South Carolina, and eventually reaching Virginia, of course. But in the process, General Sherman is going to be pretty much supervising again the destruction of the railroads in the South that were quite limited, by the way, warehouses that were storing cotton and so on, plantations were set ablaze and so on. So again, this is just, pretty much forcing the Confederacy to surrender, because there's no way you can continue waging war. Again, another painting, again, of warehouses being burned and so on. So all the cotton that couldn't be shipped out, that was actually withheld in warehouses, it was all destroyed. So eventually, General Grant and General Sherman are going to now occupy the capital of the Confederacy, Richmond, Virginia, on April 9th, 1865. And there, General Lee, Robert E. Lee again, who was the general of the Confederate forces there in Virginia, will have to surrender there. He surrendered in Appomattox Courthouse, which that, of course, signaled the end of the Civil War. Okay, so in this session, we covered now, the last portion of the historical background and the coming of and process of the Civil War. So when we come back in session 3, we're actually going to look at the aftermath. We're going to look at Reconstruction, particularly this process of Reconstruction, how the country was rebuilt after the Civil War all the way to 1877. Okay, this is all I have for you. So we'll continue then, again, this topic, the Civil War and Reconstruction, when we come back in session 3, so we can look at the aftermath, the process of Reconstruction, etc. Everything when we come back once again in session 3. Thank you.